Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 157, The Black Death and Other Calamities, which is also episode 19 of season 8, From the Interregnum to the Golden Bull. In around 1320, near the lake Issy-Kul in Kyrgyzistan, the rats started dying. Shortly after, the inhabitants became affected with terrible diseases. Some started coughing up blood, and all who did died within 3 days. Others developed swellings of the lymph nodes, particularly in the groins and armpits. Roughly half of them died within 5 days. A small number saw their feet and fingertips turn black. All of those died. Everyone who could still leave sought refuge in the towns and villages that had not been affected. The disease traveled with them. By 1330, Chinese chroniclers recorded a plague affecting the Mongol hordes. In 1346, a Mongol army besieging the Genoese trading city of Caffa on Crimea succumbed to the disease. In their final push to cower the defenders, they catapulted the diseased corpses of their comrades into the city. The siege lifted, grain transports from Caffa to Italy resumed. The disease reached Messina in Sicily in 1347. In 1348, it had enveloped most of Italy. 1349, it crossed the Alps. By 1350, people died in their thousands in northern Germany and Scandinavia. It took until 1353 before the wave of the plague had petered out, leaving between 20 and 60% of the population of Europe dead. The disease returned in 1361 to 63, 1369 to 71, 1374 to 75, 1390 and 1400. After that, intervals became longer, but the plague never went away completely, and still today a couple of hundred people die worldwide of the plague every year. Despite having lived through a pandemic only recently, we have all realized that the impact of such an event goes far beyond the gruesome statistics. It's much too recent an event to get a grasp of the impact COVID-19 had on the economy, the political system and society in general, but clearly something has changed. Now, imagine the plague, which in terms of death toll was between 10 and 30 times worse, and crucially affected young and old equally. The fallout was exponentially greater, not least because it came on the back of several other calamities. It is these impacts we will mainly focus on in this episode. So, let's dive in. But before we start, the usual reminder that this show is advertising free, and that I've also shortened this section to the absolute minimum. So please give generously on patreon.com/historyofthegermans or on historyofthegermans.com/support. And thanks so much to Jan M., Isaac B., Robin G., George B., Clive S. and Ben E., who have already signed up. And now, back to the show. The 14th century wasn't off to a good start. In 1309, weather patterns changed, and for 8 years, Europe experienced a sequence of wet summers and extremely hard winters. Now, crop failures weren't uncommon in the Middle Ages, but they tended to be short-lived. This sequence of 8 bad years was exceptional, and it had a compounding effect. Yields in 14th century were quite low. I saw numbers of just 3 or 4 grains per seed. That was above the level of the 10th century, but not much. Improved agricultural technologies, such as the horse-driven plough and crop rotation, were offset by 200 years of expansion of agricultural land into less and less productive parcels. Now the problem was that if one seed produced just 4 grains, a quarter of the harvest had to be set aside as seed for next year. So in normal years, about 10 to 30% of the produce was sold at market, depending on proximity of urban centers. The rest, aka 2 grains per one seed, were needed to feed the peasant and his family. In a crop failure, the harvest dropped to half of the normal yield or less. Now we have just 2 grains per seed. One of those is needed to seed the next harvest, and only 1 grain is available to feed the farmer or be available for sale. Now, given the producers used to have 2 grains just for themselves, they are now starving, even if they do not sell anything. But not selling anything would be difficult, since the peasant owed rent to the local lord in cash or had to deliver a fixed amount of produce in lieu of payment. But not selling anything would be difficult, since the peasant owed rent to the local lord in cash or had to deliver a fixed amount of produce in lieu of payment. So therefore he has to give some of that scarce grain away. And if he does so, the farmer then had to dip into the grain reserved for seeding next year's crop to feed his family. Which means that even if the following year is a good year, not all fields will have been seeded and the total harvest is lower than normal. Now, if you have several years of crop failure in a row, the seed reserve shrinks and shrinks, so that even in the years with decent yields, the absolute amount of harvest is down dramatically. And that is what happened in 1309 to 1317. The series of crop failures exhausted the system. And even though the Hanse merchants were now busy bringing grain from Prussia, Lithuania and even Ukraine into the empire, famine gripped almost all of Europe. As always, children were the worst affected. Childhood malnutrition has long-term outcomes for its survivors, including impaired growth, altered body composition, greater cardiometabolic disease risk, cognitive impairment, and behavioral problems. Not an ideal starting point for those children who are in their 30s and 40s when we get to the Black Death. But before that, we have a plague of locusts in 1338 and 1346, and a massive earthquake in 1348. But then comes the big one. Quote, "The mortality began in Siena in May 1348. It was a cruel and horrible thing, and I do not know where to begin to tell of the cruelty and the pitiless ways. It seemed to almost everyone that one became stupefied by seeing the pain. And it was impossible for the human tongue to recount the awful thing. Indeed, one who did not see such horribleness can be called blessed. The victims died almost immediately. They would swell beneath their armpits in their groins and all over dead while talking. Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother a brother, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight. And so they died. And none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices. Nor did the death bell sound. And in many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead. And they died by the hundreds both day and night. And all were thrown in those ditches and covered over with earth. As soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug." This is how Agnello di Tura, called the Fat, a citizen of Siena who had buried his 5 children with his own hands, described the seminal event of the 14th century, the Black Death, that lasted from 1346 to 1353 in Europe. Now, as a listener to the history of the Germans, you've already heard me giving a number of accounts of the Black Death, so I will not repeat all the well-known details. But there's something I came across recently that I hope you will find interesting. For a long time it was believed that the Black Death had been a unique event resulting from a special mutation sometime in the 14th century. But it is now firmly established that the plague had been around for thousands of years. Researchers have found DNA of Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that caused the disease, in human remains from 3600 BC. And there had been several other outbreaks, the best known of which was the Justinian plague in the 6th century, that petered out in the 8th and killed about a third of the population around the Mediterranean rim. The Black Death of 1346 to 1353 in Europe was followed by a number of regular outbreaks until it disappeared in the 18th century. 100 years later, we had several large outbreaks in Asia, and even today, people die of the plague mainly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Madagascar, and in Peru. Which leaves us with the question, why can such a devastating disease appear seemingly out of nowhere and then reappear in 10 to 15-year intervals before seemingly vanishing for centuries? Most other communicable diseases, cholera, malaria, smallpox, and COVID-19, etc., circulate in the human population until defeated by vaccination or changes in sanitation. The plague mysteriously disappeared, leaving not even immune carriers amongst the human population behind. 2 zoologists, Keeling and Gilligan, published an article in Nature in 2000 that provides a hypothesis that at least I find very convincing. Their starting point is the fairly obvious observation that the plague isn't a human disease, but first and foremost a disease of rodents, namely of rats. The fleas that transmit the disease only attack humans if they cannot find a rat to jump on. Basically, they prefer rat blood to human blood. So as long as there are enough rats for the fleas to feed on, the plague does not get transmitted to humans. There are separate populations of rats where the plague is endemic, but thanks to widespread immunity in this population, the rats don't die and therefore the fleas don't jump on the humans. And these populations might have existed all over the world and, spoiler alert, they still do. Looking at it that way, it becomes clear how these spontaneous outbreaks happen. One scenario is that a population of mostly immune rats comes into contact with another population that is not immune. In that case, the bacterium kills the rats in very much the same way it kills humans. And then the fleas run out of rats, and so they attack the humans. Alternatively, the rats die for another reason. For instance, the lack of food due to widespread crop failure, and then the same thing happens. Fleas run out of rats to feed on and move on to humans. So, what likely happened is that somewhere in the Mongol Empire, most probably near Lake Issy-Kul in Kyrgyzstan, for some reason the rats died, and the disease then spread to humans. Once it had hit humans, it can be conveyed not just by the fleas, but also by coughing, which may account for the rapid dissemination across Asia and Europe. And that also explains why the disease reappeared randomly over the following centuries all across Europe. Because after the first outbreak, the bacteria was still circulating in the rats that were largely immune, but not necessarily in humans. When those rats died for whatever reason, for instance because the humans killed the rats as a way to protect themselves from diseases, the hungry fleas spread the disease to humans again. And the disease then peters out once the rat population has recovered and the fleas no longer have to jump on the humans. Now here's the worrying bit. There are still populations of rats and other mammals in North America that carry the plague bacteria. These are mostly wild rats living outside the major cities, and so far no outbreak has occurred. But as the plague has had extended periods of being dormant, it could show up any moment. And once it does, the last thing we want to do is eradicate the rats. Because if we did that, the hungry fleas would overcome their disgust for human blood, and the impact would be even more catastrophic. And some of these strains have become resistant to antibiotics. So top tip from the History of the Germans podcast, don't kill rats, we may need them. But now let's go back to the 14th century and look at the impact the plague had. The first wave of plague took 3 years from the first reported cases in Messina in Sicily in 1347 until the disease took hold in Scandinavia, and another year to make it to Poland. But when it came with force. In 1350, the city council of Bremen ordered to list the names of everyone who had died from the plague and collected 6,966 names. Add to that an estimated 1,000 unknown corpses, and assuming the city had about 12 to 15,000 inhabitants at the time, more than half fell victim to the disease. Hamburg reported the death of 12 out of its 34 bakers, 18 out of its 40 butchers, 27 of its 50 civil servants, and a staggering 16 out of 21 members of its council. Similarly, Lübeck, Wismar, Reval, and Lüneburg reported death rates of 30% and more amongst the members of their city councils. We have less detailed numbers for the south of Germany and Bohemia, but the estimates range from 20 to 60% of the population dying from the plague. We then have another series of pan-European outbreaks, as I said, in 1361-63, 69-71, 74-75, 1390 and 1400, each taking another material percentage of the population. The historian Jörg Hönisch estimates the population in what is today Germany to have fallen from 6 to 7 million to 4 to 4.5 million, and the empire overall from 12 to 13 million to 8 or 9. We also notice that the reproduction rate during the period declined, and given the high mortality, population numbers kept declining consistently until 1420. Now, unsurprisingly, such a massive cull did have huge implications for the economy, for the society, and for politics. Let's start with the economics. And spoiler alert, as horrible as all that sounds, it wasn't all bad. Now imagine a world where practically overnight 30% of the population disappears. More in the densely populated cities and maybe somewhat less in the countryside. The first thing is that there are simply less mouths to feed. Demand for foodstuff drops dramatically. When demand drops, prices drop. Prices for foodstuff were determined in the cities. With the urban population contracting even faster, grain prices in particular declined rapidly in nominal terms. In real terms, the decline was even more significant because the gold and silver coins did not vanish with its previous owners, causing material inflation in other goods. This fall in grain prices had a major impact on the economic structure of the countryside. By the 14th century, the legal situation for most peasants in the empire had improved significantly. Serfdom had largely vanished and had been replaced by rents, most often paid in cash rather than in produce. As the farmers received less and less coins for their hard labor, they found themselves unable to pay the rents. The landowners, the knights, lords, abbots and bishops saw their income drop and put more pressure on the peasants to pay them in full. In this situation of falling income and rising rents, lots of peasants left for the cities, where the decline in population had created new opportunities. At which point the landowners had an even bigger problem. Significant percentage of their peasants had died in the plague. Of those that survived, a lot had run away to the cities. So to keep the remainder to toil on the land, there were two options, carrot or stick. The carrot was to pay agricultural laborers a fair wage and or reduce rents. The other was to exert force, turning them back into serfs. Depending on political conditions and geography, in some regions we have a return to serfdom, but the more common outcome was that the remaining rural population resisted, sometimes in the form of peasant revolts, until they saw their income improve. And so at the same time the rural landscape changed. With fewer people available to work on the land, the marginally productive parcels were abandoned. To improve security and efficiency, small hamlets and outlying farms were centralized into larger villages. About 40,000 settlements, roughly a quarter of the total, disappeared during the 14th century. The shortage of labor and the concentration in the larger villages further improved the bargaining power of the peasants. Many villages were able to establish their own administration, led by a Vorsteher or Schöffe, who would also assume the role of judge for minor crimes and civil disputes. Having got rid of the marginal fields, yields improved to 5 grains per seed, and by concentrating into the larger villages, production could be diversified into a broader set of products. These higher value products found markets in the cities at better prices, leading to a further improvement of the material situation for the rural population. According to an analysis by the Bank of England, this period was the one and only time between the 10th and the 18th century the real incomes of the working population materially improved. The one and only time. Now, the big losers in this game were the landowners, in particular the Reichsritter, the knights, or what we used to call the ministeriales. So far, they had maintained a fairly comfortable existence as the lion's share of the monetary proceeds of agricultural activity ended up in their pockets. But this had now changed. The knights saw that the total and their share of the agricultural income declined. And as the value of labor rose, the value of land shrunk. At the same time, their relevance as a military force was rapidly eroding, as commoners with longbows, halberds and crossbows were mowing down the flower of French, Habsburg and any other chivalry. Shut out from their main sources of income, they were left with two options: brigandry or submission under a more powerful player. A lot chose brigandry, but that turned out to be no more than a stepping stone to submission. The territorial princes, a growing force since the days of the early Hohenstaufen, got a major boost from the Black Death. Not that their resources weren't affected, but they were less impacted than the knights. They had already built a rudimentary administration and they had sources of income not associated with land ownership, such as taxes, tolls, and the ability to reduce the content of precious metals in their coins. As a consequence, the princes were able to incorporate many knightly holdings into their territories, either by convincing them that this was their only option, or, if the knight had turned brigand, by defeating and then expropriating them. But not all knights submitted to territorial lords. many preferred to align themselves with the big cities that recovered surprisingly quickly. Now, the cities had suffered the brunt of the mortality of the Black Death. Many had vanished, but those that survived were able to replenish their populations with peasants fleeing the oppression of their local lords and the lawlessness caused by the brigands. What happened in the cities with these people is still subject to debate. On the one hand, the plague and the regular outbreaks that followed created a shortage of labor, not just simple manual labor, but also artisans and merchants. Hence, ambitious men willing to build up their skills found ample opportunities to step into the shoes of their deceased predecessors. On the other hand, the richest families, the patricians, found themselves even richer than before, provided they survived. Because the patrician families were an intermarried oligarchy, so that the inheritance of the plague victims was distributed within a small pool of survivors. These survivors held all the levers of power. Remember that in most cities the council was refilled by appointment from within a small number of patrician families, not by any kind of open election. Now into this situation stumbled the impoverished knights asking for help in fending off the greedy princes on their doorstep. The cities were happy to take them in as so-called Pfahlbürger, citizens but, despite their aristocratic background, not patricians. They could stay on their castles and they would form part of the city's military force. As a consequence, we find now cities in the German-speaking part of the empire like Nuremberg, Rothenburg ob der Tauber or Zurich with large territories around their cities, a bit like the contados of the Italian communes. Now this structural change in the cities caused serious friction. On the one hand, the patricians flouted their inherited wealth and were less and less interested in economic activity, whilst the artisans, some of whom had become successful entrepreneurs, found themselves shut out of political power. And the social underclass of laborers, apprentices, maids and servants found themselves often in circumstances not better and sometimes even worse than the villages they had left. Insurrections against the patricians and the city councils they controlled happened therefore in regular intervals all across the empire. They were often triggered when the inept patrician administration had borrowed excessive amounts for prestige projects, leaving the community over-indebted, which subsequently required tax increases. These insurrections were most often suppressed, usually with the help of patricians from neighboring cities and the Pfahlbürger, the knights who had joined the cities. But over time, in particular the southern and western German cities allowed artisan representation on the city council. The Hanse was an exception, since the patricians were closely linked across the core cities and suppressed these attempts to overthrow their regime, something we discussed in the series on the Hanseatic League. All these economic and political changes leave behind a quite fundamentally different empire. An empire where the population shrinks, where economic activity shifted towards the big cities, where the knights see their role eroding and turn to brigandry, peasants gain more freedom and self-determination. But beyond these material changes, something also changed in the minds of the people. The initial reaction is best described by Agnello di Tura, called the Fat, our friend from Siena. Quote, "And then, when the pestilence abated, all who survived gave themselves over to pleasures. Monks, priests, nuns, and laymen and women all enjoyed themselves, and none worried about spending and gambling. And everyone thought himself rich because he had escaped and regained the world, and no one knew how to allow himself to do nothing. Each person lived according to its own caprice, and everyone tended to seek pleasure in eating and drinking and hunting and catching birds and gaming." End quote. But he clearly leaves out the bits not suitable for a family show. Emerging from the trauma, suddenly rich beyond their expectations, and having realized how short life could be, people went all out for hedonism. This is the time when fashion went from shapeless tunics into tight-fitting leggings and short jackets for men and body-hugging dresses for women. Boccaccio published his Decameron, which is full of stories about practical jokes and erotic adventures. Chaucer, who writes not much later, has his fair share of saucy stories too. But beyond this outbreak of fun or debauchery, depending on your viewpoint, the society in the 14th century was still asking the most obvious question. Why? Why did they have to live through a century of plague, famine, war, and death? Why did God release the four riders of the apocalypse on us? The reaction to this question varied. The Avignon Church, its corruption, wealth and ostentation, made a great scapegoat, in particular in the empire where anti-clerical sentiment was already deeply ingrained. And also in the Decameron or in Chaucer, the dissolute cleric is a classic trope. Others saw the failure in themselves, their sinfulness and their lack of repentance. The flagellants appeared across all of Europe, groups of initially only men who would whip themselves 3 times a day, twice publicly and once in private in the night. The reason for that was from a letter, allegedly written by Jesus, where he promised not to destroy the world as long as there would be regular lashings and people would honor the Sunday rest. Now, contrary to the usual perception, few flagellants joined these groups permanently. The idea was to do penance for 33 1/3 of a day, 1 day for each of Jesus' life on earth. People from all walks of life took part, from the desperately poor to the rich merchants and even nobles. Women were admitted only fairly late in the movement's short history. The flagellants as a concept had been around since 1261, but they only turned into a mass movement when the plague hit and probably helped a lot in spreading the disease. The official church opposed the movement as it further exposed their worldliness, and they succeeded in suppressing it by the 1350s. Now, the flagellants were a pretty gruesome spectacle, but largely harmless. Because there was a horrific way how people tried to make sense of what happened. And as so many societies before, they laid the blame for the calamity on the other, the outsiders. And the most other group in the world of the 14th century were the Jews. They had their own language, their own laws, communities, and above all, they were the only non-Christian religion tolerated in Europe. Before 1348, there were 350 Jewish communities in most towns and sometimes villages along the Rhine River and its tributaries. Most of these communities were quite small. The larger ones in Mainz and Trier counted about 250 to 300 people, Cologne was significantly larger, and Nuremberg might have had as much as 1,500 Jewish inhabitants out of its maybe 25,000 citizens overall. Jews had been living in the area along the Rhine since the time of the Romans. The Jewish community in Cologne is recorded from the 4th century onwards. In the 11th century, Worms and Mainz had been centers of Jewish learning, law and culture of international significance. Now, life for the Jewish communities became more and more constrained since the time of the Crusades. We have talked about the massacre of the Jewish communities in the build-up of the First Crusade in episode 53, still the only episode of this show with an NSFW rating. Ever since the 11th century, Jews in the empire enjoyed the protection of the emperor, not because he recognized them as fellow monotheists, but because that was how he justified taxing them especially hard. Frederick II being the notable exception, not for the taxation, but for the respect he paid them. This protection was not always effective, as central authority declined, so that the obligation to keep them safe and the associated taxes were increasingly assumed by the territorial princes, often the bishops. Despite this promise of safekeeping, there had been persecutions and pogroms before 1348. In 1298, a pogrom killed about 3,000 people, and another one in 1336 and 1338 happened in Bavaria. The leader of one of these attacks, the knight Ussingham, was finally apprehended by the Bishop of Würzburg and executed, though by that time the 900 Jews of Würzburg lay dead already. The persecution of the Jews wasn't specific to the empire. King Edward I had expelled the Jews from England in 1290, following a long tradition, whilst in France expulsions were ordered in 1254, 1306 and 1322. This may explain the relative density of Jewish populations in the empire, where they enjoyed a still precarious but somewhat safer existence. All that came to a dramatic end when the plague hit in 1348. Rumors had spread from the south of France that the Jews had poisoned the wells in order to wipe out the Christians, adding to previous notions that Jews murdered Christian children in satanic rituals and desecrated the host. All baseless, just in case I need to say that. These rumors were taken up with great enthusiasm across the empire, and a terrifying mass murdering and killing began. Some of these pogroms were driven by a mob that formed spontaneously. But more often than not, the persecution of the Jews was tied in with local politics, if not authorized by the authorities. To give an example, we can look at what happened in Strasbourg. The city had been in the midst of one of these constitutional crises that I have described before. The artisan guilds and lower classes demanded participation in city politics from the patrician rulers of the city. The leaders of the revolt took advantage of the febrile atmosphere and blamed the Jews for the plague and demanded that the council should therefore kill them all. The Ammeister, the senior city magistrate, refused, and the city guard protected the Jewish community. But public pressure was such that the Ammeister was forced to step down, and as the chronicler recorded, quote, "On Friday they caught the Jews. On Saturday they burned them. There were about 2,000 of them. Those who converted were spared, and children were taken out of the fire against their parents' wishes, baptized and brought up by Christian families. All the debts owed to the Jews were cancelled, their pawns and letters of credit returned. The cash was distributed amongst the guilds." End quote. And just to complete the story, the Ammeister, who had tried to protect the Jews, was exiled and his fortune split amongst the patricians. It was often the debt, including the debt of the city itself, that enticed the authorities to join and sometimes even organize the persecution. Nuremberg owed 70,000 gold guilders to the Jewish community, roughly the city's annual budget. Their Jewish community perished. Some cities tried to protect their Jewish neighbors, like Frankfurt and Ulm, though the mob in Frankfurt did get its way in an orgy of bloodshed in the end. Which leaves the question, where was the emperor, the official protector of the Jews? And that emperor was Karl IV, King of Bohemia. He did well in his own homelands in Luxembourg, Bohemia and Moravia, where the Jewish communities remained largely unmolested. As for the rest, not so much. Some have argued that given he had only just gained full recognition as the king of the Romans in 1349 and was heavily indebted, and therefore his ability to provide any material protection was limited. But that is only part of the story. In his negotiations with the cities and with Ludwig of Brandenburg, he disposed of Jewish property even before the owners had been killed. In Nuremberg, he approved the destruction of the synagogue and its replacement with a church, which made clear that Karl would not raise a finger to protect the largest Jewish community in his realm. 2 days later, the burning began. With that, at least in my eyes, he had moved from heartless passivity to collaboration, a stain on his character he never recognized or even mentioned. As for Jewish life after the Black Death, some communities recovered, often those where the territorial lord or the city council had kept them safe. But Jewish life remained a shadow of its former vibrancy. Many jurisdictions imported the Venetian concept of a separate quarter for Jews, the ghetto. The former role in high finance was assumed by the banking families of Augsburg and Nuremberg, forcing the Jews down to being small-time traders and moneylenders to the poor. They were made to wear special headgear, the Judenhut, and a yellow marker on their clothes. As time went on, they were formally expelled from various cities and territories, namely Strasbourg in 1389, Prague in 1400, Vienna in 1421, Augsburg 1440, Breslau 1453, and Carinthia in 1496. Many Jews left for Poland, where King Casimir the Great and his successors welcomed them with open arms, and where they helped the cities and the country to prosper. Was this all that followed from the Black Death? Well, probably not. But this is all I have time for today. I have not yet decided what we'll look at next week, but probably the much more cheerful topic of Karl IV's expansion of the city of Prague, turning it into the largest city in the empire, and leaving behind monuments that still take your breath away today. I hope you will join us again. And before we go, just the usual reminder that this is only possible because some of you are generous enough to support the show, either by becoming a patron, by signing up on patreon.com/historyofthegermans, or by making a one-time donation on historyofthegermans.com/support.